to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. This podcast is sponsored by YakkerTech, softball's first in-game optical tracking system and most accurate data capturing solution. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I am Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. Today, we have a good chunk of the S2 team here with us. Laura McDonald, our head sports scientist, and then Carly Sewell, who's been here obviously throughout this series, our head strength coach here at S2 Breakthrough. Guys, welcome together to Redefine a Circle. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to have all three of us on for this discussion is because we're talking about when athletes experience pain. What happens when the body breaks down a little bit? What does that system look like? Why does that happen? How do we handle things like that? And really leaving one of us out of this discussion would be like a puzzle piece, just not quite there. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to all come together. I had mentioned this in the last episode, but just for the next week or two, we're going to continue to go on Zoom just, for these podcast episodes, only because don't want to interfere with wearing masks. We've been wearing masks around each other. Don't want to be doing that right now, to influence the audio at all. So bear with us for a couple more weeks here on Zoom as we record this. Okay, so let's jump right in, guys. We have talked a lot. Carly and I have talked a lot, specifically in the last couple of weeks, about the role that strength and conditioning plays. And really, we keep kind of labeling it as it's the resiliency. The goal of it is to build resiliency against, the motion, how demanding the motion is, and generally just the demands of the game, particularly at the youth level. That's like a whole nother probably like saga that we could go into and for the sake of keeping this podcast an appropriate amount of time. But what the types of things that we see happening and the demands placed on our youth athletes in the travel ball world, the amount of games, the intensity, the volume, just the number of months they're in season. As you all know, it's damn near abuse essentially to the body. And so this is a concept that we just talk about a lot, because even if we feel like we have a really strong system and strength program, the demands of, again, just the motion in general, let alone the demands of the game, the overarching setup and environment of the game right now, sometimes just take over that. And so we'll have athletes that break down a little bit and start to have something beyond just like typical soreness. So the first thing that I really want to talk about as we're talking about this concept is like how we've created an environment at S2 Breakthrough to have our athletes feel comfortable talking about this. And what we really started to see early on is that our athletes, and I think athletes in general, they're afraid of pain. I mean, we've all been there. You feel like you experience some sort of like excessive discomfort, pain. You just like, don't say anything because then I'm not gonna be able to pitch. I'm not gonna be able to play. That's just the nature and the spirit of an athlete. And so we know that happens. We've actually had discussions with coaches that are like, we've never had so many people reporting pain, like what's going on? And we're like, it's not because there's more pain, it's because now they're comfortable reporting it. And this is an important start to this conversation, because what we do is obviously every single day our athletes train, they have to fill out a wellness questionnaire, which asks them specifically about readiness, arm readiness, excessive discomfort, soreness, pain, all of these things. And so if they're not comfortable just saying it verbally, we at least can see it in their wellness questionnaires, which will flag us. And the reason why we really want to create a healthy environment for our athletes to talk about, like, my body doesn't feel right, is because the reality is what we don't want our athletes doing is just pushing through that discomfort and pain, like pretending it doesn't exist, because then it snowballs into something that maybe is a problem. So what we really the environment we've really worked hard to create at S2 is to get the athletes to understand, like, this is a part of the gig. Like, your body is not, you're not a robot. You're not a piece of steel. You're going to break down sometimes. And especially after like really demanding tournaments and such. Let's just talk about how you're feeling. Tell us where that discomfort is. And then it might be something we can just sort of like take a different approach, take the right approach, and you don't miss anything at all. So I really have felt, proud of that system here at S2 because it gets our athletes speaking so freely and so comfortably about how their bodies are feeling, because they feel like the earlier I speak, really it might not be anything at all. Like I could just attack it early rather than just hiding it or squashing it for a while. So I think that's the very first piece. And the first suggestion that I would obviously give to any coaches watching this, even from a pitching coach standpoint to a strength coach, Laura kind of representing the like AT world in today's discussion, just is to make sure that environment is really is strong wherever, whatever system you're working with. Okay, so let's kind of go into some details here. So if we have an athlete that reports to us that she's experienced not typical for her, it's not just some soreness that typically goes away in a day or two. There's something that's sort of like firing and making the pitching motion uncomfortable, or making daily activities uncomfortable, or making lifts uncomfortable. The first thing that I obviously do, Laura, I'm going to kind of start off with you, is I say like, okay, let's schedule you a meeting or a time where you can get in the like AT room essentially with Laura. And I want to hear from Laura about what the route is, and then we can create a game plan of like, how are we handling this? So can you just take the conversation at this point, Laura, and tell me about like, what do those consultations look like? And then what are some of the typical things that you see? I obviously know from the standpoint of pitching that I see, but I kind of like you to kind of steer that conversation to start.
Yeah. So honestly, it's a lot of questions just to start. Obviously understanding not just the discomfort and pain that's happening in the pitching motion, but I want to know, how is this pain affecting, things outside of the softball world? How are things at home? Is there anything at home that they're not able to do that they normally do? So for example, like a shoulder injury or shoulder pain, can she wash her hair normally, reach up in the cupboard for a cup, simple things like that? We kind of ignore the impact that shoulder pain or any other pain in the body can have on an athlete when we're only talking about them as an athlete. So I really try to get to, what is the extent essentially is this pain and discomfort causing you? So a lot of questions about, how does this impact you outside of softball? Try to put together a story of a timeline of maybe some understanding of, I took a break, or I was in a different sport and I just all of a sudden started throwing again without a whole lot of ramp up. I try to understand some of the backstory in terms of the timeline, essentially try to get to a point where we're talking about, what is the accumulation of stresses that led up to this. And most of the time, it's usually a spike in workload, or sometimes we've changed some things maybe in their pitching program, and their body's just struggling a little bit to adapt to it. It's a lot of questions, honestly, just like really getting to just the timeline and the history of all that conversation. I would say that by far, the most common things that I see, they really, for pitchers especially, they get rooted in really 4 places. It's typically the stride foot, low back, SI joint in the hip. That typically happens when an athlete is typically not strong enough. It happens with our underweight athletes or underweight pitchers, where their body literally just doesn't have the armor to protect itself against the energy that they're producing as a pitcher. So sometimes it'll show up in that stride foot, hip, low back. If they're fortunate enough that the energy can get up to their trunk, next comes the scapula. So we might see, scapular malposition. So the scapula actually can kind of permanently become malpositioned in very severe cases. But more often than not, it might be, muscle dysfunction, muscle soreness, quote unquote knots that can happen around the scapula. To me, that's just an expression of that their body's struggling to make that transition of energy up the chain. And so we can't just look at, the arm or the elbow, which are my next 2 examples, in isolation, because all of that is connected, of course, to everything they create from the ground. And then the next 2 places are going to be anterior shoulder, and a little bit of kind of the posterior shoulder on the side here with like rotator cuff. But for pitchers, typically anterior shoulder. And we're usually discriminating between like bicep pain and then lat pain. Those 2 structures really interact very closely with each other. And so we can kind of get a mixed signal, whether that anterior pain is one of those 2 structures. Sometimes it's both. And then the last place is the elbow. We don't have, in softball pitching, we don't have the same stresses on the UCL that a baseball pitcher does. So sometimes elbow pain gets confused with essentially like pronator flexor pain, which starts at the same place on the inside of the elbow. That usually shows up in a pitcher who is struggling with trunk arm timing and is really trying to just use that forearm, supination to pronation to generate her whip. And that energy is sort of kind of getting rushed to the elbow, and then she's trying to get it all out through the arm. Those by far are the 4 key places that I typically see pitchers struggle with pain and dysfunction.
So when an athlete, you'll come to me and you'll say, here's what the root is. She reported this, I did this, and this, and here's what I think is going on. And really the next place they go right over to Carly, right? Because in our minds, there's this foundation of diagnostics essentially. So AT World Diagnostics, and then to the next one of Carly, which is in my mind always the foundation of any skill that we do, right? From just the nature of what it is, the nature of it being lower intensity, of it being an environment that's all about movement quality, body control. And so can you guys just sort of bridge the gap, either one of you jump in, of what happens then in your conversation? And then Carly, how do you take over on the strength floor from there?
Yeah, so I'll let Carly jump in a second, but typically I take my sort of report on the athlete, I bring it to Carly and Ashley and kind of give them my, this is fatigue. This is not a specific injury. It's essentially just an area of dysfunction currently based on her movement patterns. I bring that information to them, and then I'm going to let Carly take over kind of where she bridges that gap.
I think the first thing that's most important is looking at the wellness questionnaire, going back in time and looking at the maybe acute workload. So did they have a spike in acute workload, whether that be high school strength and conditioning that they started, in season softball, throwing volume spiked, their sleep, their diet. Take all those considerations into fact there. And then once that's laid out and okay, they're not eating enough, this isn't acute workload spike. Now you can get to the root of, all right, all those baskets are covered. Let's get to the root of this. So once I know wellness questionnaire looks great, then I start to deep dive into what is actually causing this. So I go a little bit deeper. I take them through a functional movement screen breakout, but a little bit deeper into that. So I'm looking for stability motor control disorder. I'm looking for what is actually causing that pain. So I get them into different positions on the ground, on the bench, take them through active range of motion and passive. And from there, I'm able to get a pretty good understanding of where that athlete needs movement and what is causing either the limited movement that's causing the pain or what is directly causing that pain.
So I'm going to summarize a little bit here, Car. So essentially you take them through a couple screens to identify what movement is being generated that's causing pain, which basically gives you a plan for then what movement to give them, which is going to drive the movement in the right parts of the body, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's sort of like this symptom root conversation that we just obviously keep returning to because it's everything that we do here at S2. And so then you get an idea of okay, because she's doing X in place of, instead of being able to control her trunk in this position, she's relying on this. So I'm going to give her this environment to force her, heavy constraint environment, to really force her to stabilize well and to move appropriately.
Yep. And then I think there's another side to this as well. So sometimes we have athletes who they clear everything on the strength floor with me movement wise. There's no stability, motor control disorders. But once they get into the cage, super high intensity, now they're starting to break down. So then that's a mechanical inefficiency right there. That tells me you have the strength. It's just in the bullpen. So it's a mechanical deficiency that we are attacking. So that's something that we need to really deep dive in warm up. That's not really more of a strength and conditioning concept. That's a warm up concept of what needs to be primed. And I'm referring back to this as in a pleasure pain concept. So pleasure being, if you're a good mover, you have good strength and it's a breakdown in the bullpen, then that's going back to what are you doing before you get into the bullpen? If you don't lift and you have pain in the bullpen, then it's probably you're not strong enough for what you're doing in the bullpen.
Yeah. And I think it just comes to speak to this sort of hierarchy of how once someone enters this sort of they need monitoring from a wellness standpoint, there's a hierarchy here, right? I don't just go grab them and like come up with drills. It starts with Laura. She lays out the picture, again, route, and then also like whether or not it's okay to move that day. Oftentimes it is. And you'll say like, she needs to move today. And so I think that's what's really interesting. It's like the overwhelming majority of the time that we deal with cases like this, Laura, what you are not saying is she should shut down. That does happen. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But oftentimes you'll say she needs to move and she needs to really focus on X, Y, and Z. Right. And so Carly's piece comes into play. And then really we're talking about like, how is she feeling between her response on the strength floor and the pitching side of things? So basically, again, I mean, this is very, very common for us that an athlete walks off the strength floor that day and is like, I feel fine. I feel great, because she essentially was able to tap into movement, kind of get her body back into where it needed to be to take the workload off of some of the levers that maybe she was utilizing. If she's pain-free coming off the strength floor, we'll let her throw and we'll just gauge it. Obviously, everything we do here at S2 gradually builds up from low to high intensity. So it's a really great way for us to pinpoint when the environment becomes too much for that athlete. And so are there times where she can just go all the way through her workout and feels great? Yeah. Are there times where she feels good through low intensity, maybe 50, 75, but then she's like at 100%, I don't feel great. We're like, no problem. Shut it off. Tomorrow, let's repeat and let's see. And we'll just kind of keep growing that. And then obviously there are times where they leave the strength floor and they still just don't feel great. And we're like, it just needs a little bit more time. So like, no pitching today, no problem. We're going to repeat the same work with Carly tomorrow when you come back. And we're just going to kind of go from there. So it gives us a really clear way of knowing like, can she do the next step? Can she do the next step? But understanding that hierarchy and intensity is critical in order to do that. So I would say, we don't have percentages on this, would be an interesting data point for us, but the overwhelming majority of athletes that we see that have a little bit of pain and discomfort, it's like a 2 or 3 day ordeal, right? Of just of like figuring out what it is, making sure we're creating the right environment, giving them the right advice for like, I would not go to your team practice tomorrow and pitch live. Like obviously if it's a program that we work with, then we come right in and think she is not pitching live. But if it's like, I have something for high school, we would advise them, like, I think you need a couple more days before you do this. But we're really, able to kind of work through those things pretty well with athletes. And again, I think that's why we've been able to feed such a robust system of like confidence in reporting how you feel, because they're like, if I tell them right away, I can squash it quickly before the weekend or something, which again is really, really, I just think a really important piece here. Okay. So that sounds like cookie cutter. That sounds like, magic land, because sometimes that happens. It's great. But it's not always magic land. As we know, this is real life. And so there are times where pitchers are experiencing something and like we are not, we just can't quite, we identify what we think the root is. We obviously don't have x-ray vision or imaging. And so we identify what we think the root is. We're trying to drive some things. It just doesn't seem to be helping enough. And basically they have to enter an external world, right? They get referred out, which happens. Great if it does that. If it doesn't, our goal is obviously to build enough resilience everyday programming to have a good internal system for management where that it doesn't come to that. But when it does, and they have to seek medical attention and they get pulled out of the game or out of training for a bit, sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's 2 weeks, it could be a month, whatever it might be. We run into some challenges, and I kind of want to use this as an opportunity to talk about it. Let me lay out what we typically run into, and then Carly, Laura, feel free to chime in here. Here's what we run into oftentimes. Athlete A goes and seeks medical advice. They say something like, weak anterior core, so you're not rotated well or something, right? And so go to PT. Okay, perfectly logical. Athlete goes to PT. PT says something like, okay, you're clear with me, or at some point you're still in PT, but you're clear to start training, no lifting, because in their minds, lifting is like everyone's trying to deadlift 500 pounds. So no lifting, but hit, swing, throw, play away. And so what we know to be the case is that skipping steps, right? And so when athletes come to us, they're like, I can pitch, I can do whatever I want, I just can't lift. We're like, that's not how we do things here. That's not what lifting is here. The lifting is the foundation. If you have pain, if you don't have pain in pitching, you're going to be fine on the strength floor, right? And so that's just the reality. But if you have pain in pitching, but we skipped over a step, we don't really know where we are in that system, right? This concept of like, it's got to go, PT is low level intensity. The jump between that and skill is like, that's ridiculous. There's not a bridge big enough in the world to connect those two pieces. And so it's like, strength and conditioning is that bridge, right? Especially S2 breakthrough strength and conditioning. That is about movement quality, understanding roots versus symptoms, really getting the athletes to be body aware, activating the right muscle groups, and then carrying that into skill. And we run into those challenges because we don't like to put athletes into positions where they feel like my external medical advice doesn't match the internal piece of S2 breakthrough. That's been challenging for us, right? We've also had some really great PTs that jump right into phone calls with us. We get on the same page. We show them what their strength and conditioning program looks like. We talk to them about low intensity stuff and pitching, and we have a great relationship with that. But there's a problem, absolutely, with connecting that outside pain management world to the inside pain management world. And obviously, I kind of just gave an overview there. But Laura, I'll start with you. If you have anything else to add about how we maneuver through those, and how we basically try to keep the athlete in a really an appropriate system, but a cohesive and not a confusing, without giving her confusing messages.
Yeah, it starts so much with for the athlete to understand how to advocate for themselves. That's why I think it's so critical that they understand their story. We communicate their assessment results. I try to be very clear with both them and their parents about what to expect in this process as they're being, referred out and entering into a very confusing healthcare system, right? The healthcare system is very fragmented and there's just so many pieces to it. And so I try to just kind of give a summary essentially of like what to expect. If you see your primary physician, you will probably have a script for PT. You might be given anti-inflammatories. Here is sort of the general, the journey you're going to go on. And then what I always try to offer at the end is, if your physical therapist or whoever that you deal with from a rehabilitation standpoint would like to talk to us, I want to do that because I want to be able to educate that person that, we're not out here deadlifting 500 pounds. And we really are very conscious about that transition from the PT table through strength and conditioning back to pitching. And it's all a continuum. I sort of judge the severity of that athlete's dysfunction on, how much is it affecting her home life and her school life, first and foremost. Is she sleeping okay? Is her back pain so severe that she's not able to sleep comfortably at night? That's a significant red flag. So in that severity, we want her, of course, to see a healthcare professional that can deal with those, that level of severity. And then we want her to come back to us ready to kind of get into the moderate level, which is for us strength and conditioning, right? As a continuum of physical therapy, as a continuum of rehabilitation. They're not separate concepts. And Ashley's right. The most common thing we see is this scenario of, the athlete goes to a rehabilitation specialist, whoever that might be, and they come back and it's like, all right, go ahead, full force. And their body isn't ready for that. And so it's a lot of conversation. It's a lot of getting them to understand. The athlete's obviously very anxious to get back to pitching, no question. And it can be hard to be the gatekeeper of that a little bit. I know Carly can attest to this. I know Ashley can attest to this. It's hard to be the gatekeeper. It's hard to tell a pitcher, especially somebody who's been out for a while, you got to hold back a little bit, So we are very conscious in our return to throwing and return to pitching programs. I think one of the toughest scenarios is when a pitcher is given a return to pitching program and it's just sort of like a blanket X number of pitches at this distance. And it's not cognizant of everything that has to go underneath that for her to be able to do any sense of a return to pitching program. That is just very common. And I've had conversations with great physical therapists who are like, yep, I get the kinetic chain. I understand that she's got to start from the ground up. I explain the fact that we use low intensity throwing. I think that's unique to us. We don't go right out and have them pitch 100%. There is such an in-between in this continuum from rehabilitation to strength and conditioning to low intensity throwing with a 7-ounce plyo, keeping it really simple before she's fully back in a bullpen. So I just try to educate on our system and explain that she's not going to go from, 0 to 100 without a lot of steps in between with us. And I think that usually helps to kind of ease that transition a little bit and make that athlete feel like, okay, even if I'm not throwing 100%, I'm still making some progress.
And we have some pretty solid return to throw programs. I'm going to talk obviously just specifically about pitching right now, but that we utilize a lot and have been really successful. Obviously, each athlete is different. So monitoring her response, there's no two athletes that are the same. But as far as kind of similar to like ramp up, right? I mean, it's a very similar concept of just like, okay, low volume, low intensity, build moderate volume, low intensity, higher volume, low intensity. Okay, now we're going to stay, we know like we can kind of gauge of like, she can build volume, but we haven't gone up in intensity yet. Let's go back to moderate. We're going to go half low, half high. Like we have some pretty good, systems that we've utilized over and over and over again, and just track. As long as she feels pain-free doing that, she can progress. That she had a lot of soreness the next day, stay there. And so, personally for me, I get frustrated when someone comes and brings a return to throw program. Because I'm like, this is crazy. Like, who gave this to you, And so I think of like, we are the people, we're the system that can really create a good return to throw, monitor wellness, monitor appropriate intensity, volume, how that builds. And so I just think that's really important. Is to understand that like, I think Krista puts this well. When she has conversations like this with athletes, like your medical team, they know a lot about that specific area they're working with, but they don't know the ins and outs of your skill, nor should they. That's us, right? And so once you get this sort of clearance from them, you come back into this internal system, and then really it's our job to gauge what's appropriate for you. It doesn't make any sense for a PT to tell you how much pitching you can do. They don't know the pitching motion. So that is something that I think has gotten better here. I think it's just like our explanation and having really solid return to throw programs and ramp up programs that has allowed athletes to see like, okay, I see the plan and I can buy into that. So I think culture has been a lot stronger here at S2 with bridging that gap, external to internal, but it's still a continuing challenge, continues to be a challenge because of, as you said, sort of that like fractured healthcare system at the moment. Car, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Coming from a strength and conditioning side, I think the biggest thing when working with external healthcare is knowing that your program is not going to stand alone. So it's not the only thing the athlete is doing. So your job is almost to turn from a strength coach to a stress management coach, knowing that they're doing high volume at PT. They're probably already addressing certain scenarios. So your job is to provide the medicine of getting the athlete stronger. So probably going a lot of low intensity, lifting heavy where we can, and just changing the mindset of killing them with volume of low intensity and switch it to pure strength.
Yeah, I think like we spend the majority of time here trying to make our athletes resilient to the game. Like what I feel, and you guys can chime in if you feel a little bit differently about this, but what I feel our job is like, we often don't get the luxury of like helping athletes like reach these crazy performance metrics for a variety of reasons. They're teenagers. I mean, we have college athletes as well, obviously, but the majority of the year we're working with high school athletes, just age wise, that's not even appropriate for them. Right. And so, often though, what we're really trying to do is like undo patterns, trying to make their patterns more efficient, give them a base, keep them healthy through these like insane demands of travel ball. And so what we want to do is like, we want to be able to send them off to college where they're like, just at this foundation are like ready to take off. So I think a really important discussion, and I've had this discussion recently with some pitchers and their parents, is like, I know that you want to feel like, okay, I'm going to this Power 5 school. I need to be throwing 67 now, like now as a junior, because that's what people at that level do. And what I say is like, but your patterns are poor. Like basically, in order to do that, you want to be able to do that when you're there. You want to feel like you're bringing a version to yourself that is healthy, that is strong, that has good patterns inside and outside of the motion, all related concepts, obviously. So now as soon as you get there, you just take off. That is what I really feel like our job is, right? And I think this world, again, we're going to be getting maybe a little off topic, so I'm going to keep this short here. But what our world has been is this like, give the kids the metrics now. Give the kids the metrics now. And it's like, we're just fuel and fire oftentimes. Wellness is at the center of what we're doing. And maybe there will be a time where the competitive environment that we've built around them isn't destroying their bodies, but it is right now. That is the reality. It absolutely is. And so I love to be involved in a world where we start to change that conversation for athletes, and where they're not spending so much of their training time sort of like rebuilding against what the game sort of like knocked out of them. But that's where we are right now. And so I think this concept of just like pain, discomfort, management of that system, that's at the heart of what we do here at S2 Breakthrough. And I don't anticipate that changing anytime soon, unfortunately. And so I just think it's a really important discussion. Like, yes, are we tracking velocity? Are we maximizing break every single day here, right? There's no doubt about it. We are absolutely looking for changes in performance, but it would be crazy for us to skip over this concept of like the wellness management system. You guys know when I onboard a remote athlete, what I say to them is like, we're not just writing a training program for you. You're entering into a system of a management system. Yes, performance, but also health and wellness. And in season, that becomes a really tough process. Like you got to stay in this system to make sure that you're not just letting let your body unravel. So I thank both of you for being in here because I think like it's such a challenging discussion and environment. Obviously, we have this luxury at S2 where we're like, I turn to my right and I ask Laura a question, then I turn to my left and I ask Carly a question. And so that's not obviously the case. If like if someone's here and they're not in a college environment where you have access to these resources and you're in, it's travel ball world, it is maybe like another facility who's watching this. At the very least, what we would say is like start to establish those relationships, right? Maybe if they can't be internal for you, but start to create those external relationships. Because as long as we're working in a silo, we're not going to do a good job. And these athletes with the current system they're in, they need us to be doing a better job for them.
I think one more piece I would feel bad if I missed this, is to understand their health histories. If you're facility listening, if you're college coach listening, doesn't matter, is to know their health histories. You're trying to understand who has the highest level of risk, so just understanding where they're coming into with their health history can help you to understand who you should be keeping an eye on. It can just be as simple as talking to your athletic trainer if you're a college coach, because they're going to know their health histories. If you're a facility owner, those are questions you should be asking about the athletes that you train, because that's really, as we're talking about managing risk and managing the intensity of the pitching motion, it starts with what they bring with them, at a clean slate.
And Laura, remembering it's about them, not you. Like I want to shout from the hilltops about that. In our social media world and the world where everything is about your brand and how good your marketing is, I get it. But the reality is like, that we have athletes here where I'm like, I do not want that athlete to throw 65 because until we can get some greater change out of her patterns, like that is a recipe for disaster. I want her to ultimately throw 65 when her patterns have given her an opportunity to be more efficient and essentially gets there. But if we're just like load her up, get her to throw hard and her patterns don't change, she's on a path toward pain, toward injury. So I think it's important. You have to understand like health history. You have to understand current patterns. It's not just about like posting that all your athletes throw 65, because I am very skeptical. I have not seen enough high school level athletes with good enough patterns that, they should all be throwing that, velos like that safely. So I think like ultimately, do we want all pitchers that come through our doors to like throw hard? Yes, but it's a path to get there. It's absolutely a path to get there. And today's discussion is all about essentially like, one of the biggest hurdles in that whole scheme. Car, anything else that you want to talk about, just sort of wrapping up here on final notes?
I think you made a good point talking about how we spend a lot of time undoing patterns or solidifying the body for our athletes. The biggest point here is that female athletes, college is basically the end of their career. So we are getting them ready for that. With male athletes, it's a lot different. So high school will bring different training mechanisms for them than female athletes. And I think if we keep looking at the baseball world or what males are doing in terms of training and performance, we will never fully develop female athletes because our timeline is so different. We don't turn on the TV Sunday and see female athletes playing sports. We're not there yet. Eventually, hopefully. But until we treat female athletes as they are and what they need, we will never reach the full potential in softball.
Yeah. And I think like we all know, as the data world is expanding across the nation, it's exciting. But it's also a responsibility for us to come in and say, like, it's not, performance and metrics at all costs. Not with 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old athletes. I mean, we're talking a whole nother ballgame here, which I think just, is important. Kind of build off of your point, Carly, is like, we are talking about, kids here. And so the first and foremost is to make sure they're healthy and they're well, so that when they go off to college, that's their time. Right? That's their time to really take off. And that's so much a part of our job. Guys, thank you so much for being on today's episode. We've got one left here in this series 2 of Redefine the Circle, Carly. Next week, we're going to talk about some details, kind of a little bit of a segue between our discussions together about the details of how you program, what goes into programming, as you're obviously preparing to sort of kick off a little bit of your own, I don't know if podcast or what, but a little bit of your own strength and conditioning networking world, a little more visible out there and social media and such. So that'll be the last one. And then we'll kick off series 3 of Redefine the Circle. So it was a pleasure. I know I get the pleasure of speaking with you guys every single day, but for us to really sit down and have like a really detailed conversation about some of these issues that we are working through and dealing with, it's reminds me just how grateful I am to have you both. So thanks for being here. And thanks to everyone out there for watching again. Looking forward to having you join again next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.